Recently, I posted on my YouTube channel to ask me anything about the music production process, and I'm gonna do my best to answer those questions. So let's go ahead and get into this. First one comes from Moonmaker 1158, how to always pick the right sounds for a track. The reality is, I don't think you're always going to pick the right sounds. I think a lot of it is trial and error, but one way that we can kind of eliminate a lot of the error is what we practice outside of creating. I sound like a broken record at this point, but the best way to get better at music production and to get better moving into the genre that you want to produce in isn't to just aimlessly wander through creating, but actually recreating songs that you like, songs that you want to make music like. And this is not an easy thing to do at all. Like, I've been making music for 20 years. I still do this to this day because this is how we train our ears. So if you're just starting off with recreating something, take the most easily identifiable thing to start with. Maybe it's an acoustic guitar sound. The first thing that we should do is understand, okay, what does this acoustic guitar sound like? Is it bright? Is it dark? Does it sound like the microphone is really close up on it? Does it sound like the microphone is far away? What tuning is this guitar in? And it's going to take deep listening, which if you're interested in learning more about what deep listening is and how to get better at it, there's a free download in the description to a deep listening prompt guide. Basically, it's a questionnaire that walks you through how to listen to surface level and then how to get a little deeper in there as well. But once you get familiar with making those sounds outside of your creative work, now you can bring that into your original work because you already know how to make the sounds that you want to make. So we got to separate creating from practice because practice is going to make creating much more of a better experience. All right, next question comes from T-Tox or TTOX. How do you get a mix to sound professional? I've crafted some high quality sounding productions, but when comparing to the actual pros of the genre, it simply does not compete. And I'm actually going to tie this in as well with Premiere Leaf 1163. What is this profile picture? Who also asks what makes a professional production sound professional? I can record a song and it sounds really good, but it's just missing something. So this may be a little controversial to say, but I only think that something sounds professional not because of any like specific tricks that pros do or anything like that. I think it just comes from a sense of familiarity. And this familiarity is relative to the recording itself. For example, if you listen to Mac DeMarco, to fans of Mac DeMarco, that sounds professional. But if you're a fan of maybe Coldplay, it might sound underproduced and it might sound not professional. So just understand that the word professional is super relative to the context in which you are producing in, right? So again, this is where deep listening comes in handy and where remaking things will really help you understand what is missing about your production versus a professional production. If you remake something as close as you can and then compare it to the original reference, your job is not done there, right? You now have to listen to what you made versus what the original reference was. And that difference right there that you spot, that is the professional sound that you are trying to get and that you are trying to chase. So that's one piece of the puzzle, right? Other things can include mix bus processing. It can include, how you manage your stereo field, how you manage your frequency spectrum. There's all these different pieces that are a little too complex to answer just based on like a professional thing because a professional sound is not one sound, right? So in order for you to understand, like I said, remake something, compare to the original, and the difference that you hear, that is what you need to focus on. All right, next comes from Small Drums. What's your favorite free plugin and why is it the Magic Dice? Also, would you ever produce a song entirely in GarageBand for one challenge? My favorite free plugin probably isn't Magic Dice, although Magic Dice is up there. Another honorable mention is probably the Magic Switch, same thing from Baby Audio. It's just my favorite chorus that I've ever heard in my life. What is my favorite free plugin? I don't know, because I also want to refer to the Klanghelm MJUC Junior compressor or the Soft Tube Saturation. So I don't think I necessarily have a desert island free plugin. I don't know. What's your favorite free plugin? Let me know in the comments. And then would you ever produce a song entirely in GarageBand for a challenge? Actually, I have a video that I'm planning right now. All I have is the title. The title is Making a Song in GarageBand to Prove It's Not About Gear. So not only will I be making a song in GarageBand, but I'm also going to try to put together a preset pack for GarageBand as well. Which, by the way, if you didn't know, I actually sell presets for Logic Pro. Link is in the description to go check those out. All right, another question about getting things to sound professionally from Michael J. Anderson, 1116. How do you get recording to sound like a professional recorded record? I'm like 80% there, but what does it actually take to get 100% there? Any mixing and mastering tips? I want to mention as well that everybody, we need to stop focusing on the word professional, because I do think that your mindset and what you tell yourself dramatically affects your ability to do what you need to do. What is it called? Limiting belief, I think it is. Something else as well, you just need to focus on getting it done, because done will forever be better than perfect, right? You can't just not put out music, and you can't just not create something because you don't feel like it's professional enough to put out into the world, right? If you go back in some of my earlier videos, they sound like crap. Like, just because I've been doing this for 20 years doesn't mean that I've been making good music for 20 years. Like, I'd say the last 3 years, maybe even 2 years, has been some of my better work that I've put out. But part of what makes a professional sound like a professional is the fact that they put it out, right? Something else I want to mention as well is you have to have good sounds to begin with. You can't just use stock sounds and expect them to work together. You have to understand the context of different elements. You know, does this piano pair right with these drums, or am I just selecting things that sound good on their own? Like, we need to produce within the context of other elements that we put in the song. And that takes time. Just setting up practice sessions just to go through your sounds and audit them. And it's so boring, guys. It's so boring to get used to your sounds, but we need to. It's the necessary part of becoming a pro. Think about if a painter didn't experiment with different types of paint, or from different companies, or different brushes, because guess what? One brush could fit really comfortably in your hand. Another brush cannot be comfortable in your hand. Don't you think that that's going to affect the way that you paint? The same thing happens with our sounds. If we're just kind of reaching every time for sounds, just hoping we find something, you know, how do we learn and grow from that? Instead, I think you should take some time, just a couple days a week, 30 minutes at a time, like it doesn't take much, to just go through your sounds, identify them, literally have a notebook to just talk about sounds and to reference things. As nerdy and systematic as that may be, having that familiarity will allow us to become better artists, because we have a process for taking these ideas and knowing exactly what to do with them. And then down here, you mentioned any mixing and mastering tips. The best mixing tip that I can give is to focus on leveling over any processing that you do. Obviously, processing is important. I'm not saying that it's not. But when you level here, let's say that these are drums, let's say that this is the bass, let's say that this is a guitar, and this is a vocal. I usually start with leveling drums. So let's say I set my level right there. I'm sorry for my horrible drawing. Something I want to do with the level of my drums is I want to make sure I have plenty of headroom, which headroom is the space that we have above the signal that we can bring it up. When I first work with my students in the music production bootcamp, the first time I take a look in their DAW, a lot of time I'll see levels just kind of being pushed as high as they can go. When I think it's much better to record and to level things at a much lower volume. If you want it louder, turn up your interface, turn up your monitors if you want it louder. But you want to make sure that you have enough breathing room, right? But when you level, if I were to bring up this bass, I'm bringing up the bass and I'm listening to the drums instead. Because as I bring up this bass, it's gonna start to affect the way the drums sound. It's gonna affect the kick drum, it's gonna affect the snare drum. So maybe I start to bring up the bass, maybe it fits like right here, and I can hear the bass clearly, and I can also hear everything with the drums clearly. Same thing, when I bring up the guitar, it's gonna get harder because now I have to listen to how the guitar affects the bass and the drums. So the more things that you bring up in level, the harder that this is gonna be. So maybe the guitar sounds good here, and I'm listening, you know, how does the guitar affect the bass? Does it affect anything with the drums? Maybe the cymbals, maybe the toms. And if you achieve that clarity, we're gonna do the same thing again with the vocals. You know, as I bring up this vocal, how does it affect the guitar? How does it affect the bass? How does it affect the drums? So when you're practicing leveling, start relatively small. meaning don't try to practice leveling on a song that has like 100 tracks. Maybe start with like 4 tracks at a time so you can really hear the difference. And once you get comfortable with that, it's much easier to process, to pan, to get separation. And then I'm probably the wrong person to ask about mastering because I don't really like to limit things too hard. I don't like brick walling my signal. I like to have a lot of dynamics and I like to have a lot of breathability. My tracks probably aren't usually as loud enough as they should be. I'm not a mastering engineer. I'm not a mix engineer. So just focus on clarity over anything. All right, next question comes from Real Shrek 123. Just how you get a good mix and all to make everything work together and be heard. Also clarity, I feel like I struggle with clarity in acoustic guitar and vocals, also mixing drums. The best advice that I ever got, I mentioned this in several other videos, but it comes from Nathan James Larson, another great mentor on YouTube. If we produce as if mixing were not a thing, our music tends to sound a lot better. You know, if I choose the stock Logic drums when you open up a new drummer thing versus, you know, opening up something like Easy Drummer or Addictive Drums, those drums most of the time are gonna sound better than Logic drums. Don't get me wrong, Logic drums aren't bad. You know, I have several preset packs for Logic drums specifically, but they do take some work to fit in the right context of what you're trying to do. But in order for things to be clear, again, refer back to this whole example that I did here, and then make sure that you're choosing sounds that are relative to one another. A really bright and roomy live drum set does not pair nicely with a soft, intimate, warm guitar. And also, I think a lot of us see YouTube tutorials and YouTube videos and tend to think that we need to put a bunch of plugins on something to make it sound better, which is simply not true. Like if you look into any of my projects, I'm not saying I'm great or anything like that. I like how my music sounds. And if you look at my projects, there's not a lot of processing that I'm doing. Like usually when I EQ a vocal, it looks something like that. Like just so simple, very broad strokes. And that's what you need to do when you're beginning to get clarity with mixing. Don't worry about the super technical, small, surgical EQ dips and everything. Sure, there's resonant frequencies that you want to take care of, but if you're new to this and if you're struggling with just getting overall clarity, you're not going to find clarity in surgical, precise processing. You're going to find the most clarity in painting in broad strokes. So if you have an EQ and it looks something like this with all these little surgical marks on it, you're not going to hear this difference as much as you're going to hear this difference, a very broad EQ dip, right? So start with that in mind. So start with that before you take the surgical route, because in order for us to understand the surgical stuff, we need to understand the broad stuff. It's like, how can you expect to do brain surgery if you don't know how the brain works or the different parts of the brain, right? All right, next comes from Stefan B6807. What makes a song well produced? Like, what does a song need so that one can objectively say it's produced well? How can a minimalist production, for example, just piano and vocals, work so well, but then a bigger production might feel like it's missing something? This is a great question. A lot of these questions are kind of similar in like, how do we get a professional sound? How do we well produce something? And the answer to this comes from taste, okay? As I'm filming this, I actually have a newsletter going out tomorrow, which for you would have been 2 weeks ago. I have a newsletter every week. I try to write some sort of creative fuel. If you want to check that out, link is in the description as well. But let's break down what I wrote about taste. Literally, I called it the secret to getting a professional sound. So to develop taste, first we have to study the pros, right? Like I said, I'm a broken record at this point. We have to deep listen and understand what a pro does to get that sound. Once we identify the surface level things like just drums, guitar, bass, vocals, go a little deeper. What background sounds do we hear? What effects do we hear? What is filling that space? Then again, I already mentioned we need to audit our sounds. Then it comes to remaking songs. And like I said earlier in this video, spotting the difference. And if we don't know what the difference is, that's when we need to go back to step 1, where we just study more. And then after we apply it to our tracks. But the only reason that we ever feel like something may not be enough, or if it's too little or too much, is just a lack of familiarity. In order for us to understand what is too much, we need to purposefully push it so that it's too much. And this is where also having reference tracks comes in way more handy than most people realize. Am I rambling? I think I might be rambling at this point because so many of these questions feel very similar. But in order to understand what well-produced means, I think a well-produced song takes a song structure and melody and chords and serves that. You know, if we take Adele, for example, if you take away all of the production in an Adele song and it's just her voice and a piano, is that a great song? Absolutely it is. Where if we take, let's say, an EDM song and we just have like the vocal chops in there with maybe the chords, is that a great song? Probably not. Because the point of EDM is the music and how it feels, right? So in order for us to understand what well-produced means, we have to take things that we believe are well-produced and compare it to ours. I know comparison is the thief of joy, but we're not comparing in a sense of like, oh, why can't I do that? Why can't I do this? We're just listening. You know, what is the atmosphere like? What is the surround like? How bright are their instruments? How dark are their instruments? How is the structure to the song assisting the layers and the instruments, right? The best exercise that you can do to master this is to work within limitations. Whenever I demo something that's not on this channel, because on this channel, I'm just trying to show the production process. But if I'm writing something that's meaningful, that is personal to me, and I don't really want to share with others just yet, I literally have a template that only allows me to use 4 tracks: drums, bass, guitar, and a vocal. And I have to do my best to make that sound like a complete song. So that may mean changing up this guitar part so it fills this space here. Or it also may mean leaving more space. But we have to start by limiting ourselves and making the most of the instruments, making the most of the vocals, the melody, the structure, all of that first. All right, next comes from Gabe HRAV. How to layer so that there are themes of call and response, but no gaps so that there's always something interesting going on in a section, or if there are any other ways to add depth that I don't know of, but stuff like that. Well, I would almost reimagine this question. And my question to you is, why do you always want something interesting to go on? Space and gaps are so important to music. You don't want to overwhelm a listener. And this is why I think the TikTokification of music is kind of frustrating, because space is uncomfortable. Silence is very uncomfortable because we're not used to silence, right? We see like 10,000 advertisements a day, I think. Most of us have phone addiction. We always have to have something occupying us. So I don't think the question should be, how do I make it so that something's always interesting going on? I think we need to refer back to the first comment, which is how to always pick the right sounds for a track, because that space is equally as important as the fill, right? I go for runs every morning and I feel like a freak because I don't put on any music when I run. I just like to hear my footsteps. I like to hear my breath. I like to hear the birds. I like to hear the wind. It's hard, but I try to embrace silence throughout my day as much as possible. So don't think that you have to always have something interesting going on. It's not about that. That's not what music production is about at all. Music production is about serving the song and making the most out of what this song needs. Again, take a song like Hello from Adele. Could you imagine in the beginning if it was just a bunch of busy stuff instead of all that space? Like the song literally begins with one piano chord being rang out and one word, bung, hello. And then there's space before the next line. So would that song be better if there was a lot going on there? I don't think so. All right, next question comes from, this is Mick J. When do you use normal panning and when do you use stereo panning? I use stereo panning whenever I'm dealing with VSTs. So if I have like a piano, I'm gonna use stereo panning so I can bring everything over. I'm horrible at explaining normal versus stereo panning, but I use it when I'm using stereo VSTs. I use normal panning if I'm using a mono signal, like a guitar. Hope that makes sense. All right, next is from Lisden21, Great 21 Pilots lore reference there. Why is Paul Meany your favorite music producer? He's the GOAT, but other than that, Paul Meany is definitely my favorite producer because of just how weird the productions can be. It feels really fresh. It doesn't feel like he's just taking loops and stock sounds. I find that he's not afraid to push the weird. One of my favorite musicians all time, Devin from the band Flip Turn, I recently got to just create some things with him. And he is also a huge Paul Meany, Mute Math, Darren King fan. So the two of us were in here just making the absolute weirdest sounds possible. Sure. And there's a lot of exploration to be had there. So I think Paul Meany shows what it's like to really think like a producer and to take a good structure to something and really make it unique. So Paul Meany always pushes me to be a better music maker myself. All right, Jackson Lamberth, how to find the right sounds. I answered this already. You guys have a lot of similar questions here. I'll blow an hour going through Logic presets before I find the right synth sounds. Again, take time away from creating, get used to your sounds, get familiar. It's boring, nobody wants to do it, but the fact that you do it will make you a better producer, I promise. All right, this is Mick J has another question. How do you create good separation for each instrument in the track so it's easy to pick them out in a song? This is kind of a hard one because you don't necessarily want to easily pick them out because you want them to feel as if they are blending together in a way. Cohesion, that's the right word. But in order to create good separation, we need to think of a couple things. First is going to be the tonal characteristics. If I take a guitar, let's say that this is the EQ spectrum, this is 0, and then this is 20K. If I take a guitar, and let's say the main focus of the EQ spectrum is in here, and I pair it with another guitar, maybe the EQ spectrum falls in the same area, it's going to be hard to pick those out. So instead, try to find contrasting elements or overlapping elements. So if I have a guitar that's in this EQ range, maybe I can have another guitar that sort of sits in this EQ range. You know, it stands out a little bit differently than this. There's some overlap, so that way they blend enough together. But doing this for different instruments is really going to help. I'm not saying like totally isolate the EQ and everything has to have the separation in that way. Also make sure that there is overlap because that's where cohesion comes from. But what you can also do is start extremely simple. Like I said before, limit yourself to only a few tracks. And then once you have like a solid structure of the song, start adding more layers. And as soon as you feel layers starting to mesh together in a not so pleasing way and you can't really hear the difference between the layers, that's how you know, okay, I've added something that is clogging up the pipeline. I need to go back and find out what it is. And then the last question here, how to make an effective guitar wall using different kinds of sounds and takes. I mentioned this in another video, the how to get better at music production video, but I had a student named Molly who wanted to get that sort of guitar wall sound in the track that we were working on in the music production bootcamp, which by the way, link in the description. But in order to get that guitar wall first, before we add on a bunch of layers, we have to establish what the core identity of this guitar wall is. So start with one general guitar, and then compare that to the rest of the track. You know, where does it sit in the EQ spectrum? You know, if it's pretty mid-range heavy, maybe we can add something that's in the mid-low range. Maybe we can add something that's in the mid-high range. But if you continue just to stack on the same sort of sounds, you're just clogging up this one frequency. You're not able to balance things. The reason that something feels like it's a wall, at least in my experience, walls of sound are because there's an even spread between different frequencies, instead of just pushing everything through one range. I guarantee you that 3 guitars placed at different areas of the frequency spectrum are going to sound bigger than 10 guitars that are sort of in the same frequency range. That is my guarantee to you. But I hope that this video and explanation helped. I definitely want to do another one of these. I hope it went well. I hope it made sense. I guess I'll see when I edit this video. Editing Trevor here. It was okay. But if you have any other music production questions, feel free to leave a comment. I'd love to do another one of these. I hope it was helpful. If it was, hope you consider subscribing and hanging around the channel for a little longer. Check the links in the description, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.